So now, if he's ready, I'd like to introduce Robert Zubrin. Robert is the president of Pioneer Astronautics and the founder and president of the Mars Society. Robert has been an advocate of human space exploration, very prominent in the last 40 years, I'd say 30 years. He would talk a lot about his Mars Direct plan and trying to get Congress and the United States and people around the world to support that. And more recently, he's been focused on the moon, and he has a plan called Moon Direct to leverage some of the SpaceX and other hardware that's available now. So Robert, welcome to the Lunar Development Conference.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to all of you for attending this conference. And I hope you also attend the Mars Society conference, which is going to be October 15th through 18th. You can register for it at marssociety.org. In fact, I believe our call for papers is still open. So if you want to speak at it, you can send in an abstract. I'm going to talk about the matters that I talk about in my new book, The Case for Space, which is subtitled How the Revolution in Spaceflight Opens a Future of Unlimited or Limitless Possibilities. And this emphatically, of course, includes the moon, as well as Mars, the asteroids, and the stars. So let's start with the beginning, the revolution. We are in the midst right now of the most dramatic revolution in spaceflight since the Sputnik era, that is, since the birth of spaceflight. From Sputnik 1957 through, say, the moon landing 1969 or 70 for more of them, we developed the whole bag of tricks that was needed for spaceflight. Multi-stage launch vehicles, hydrogen, oxygen propulsion, in-space life support, space rendezvous techniques, docking, soft landing techniques, re-entry techniques, space navigation, deep space communication, radioisotope generators, and pretty much everything. We sent people to orbit and to the moon. We sent probes to Venus and Mars. In fact, we were well on our way with Pioneer Jupiter by that time. And so we did it. And in that time, the cost of space launch went from truly astronomical levels in 1957 down to around $10,000 a kilogram by 1970. And okay, so that was pretty good. But from 1970 to 2010, the cost of space launch remained at $10,000 a kilogram. That is, we went from incredible rates of progress during the space race to complete stagnation for 40 years. 40 years. The cost of space launch remained flat, like it was a law of nature or something. And but since 2010, it has dropped by a factor of 5. That is 40 years of stagnation, 10 years of rapid resumed progress. And of course, the cutting edge for this has been SpaceX, okay, which is now offering launch at $2,000 a kilogram. And using its mostly reusable Falcon 9s and Falcon Heavies. I say the Falcon 9 is mostly reusable because the first stage is much bigger than the second stage. So if you're reusing the first stage, you're reusing most of the rocket. And this is even more so with the Falcon Heavy. What Musk has done is proven that it is possible for a well-led entrepreneurial team to do things that it was previously thought that only the governments of major powers could do, and do them in 1/3 the time, at 1/10 the cost, and even do things that they had deemed completely impossible, period, such as reusable launch vehicles that fly back and land practically at the landing pad. I mean, this was Heinlein, science fiction, it was not reality. It is now reality. And not satisfied with that, Musk is moving on creating a fully reusable, heavier lift vehicle, the Starship, and which, if successful, will reduce launch costs by another factor of 3 or 4, down to $500 to $700 a kilogram, and with much larger payloads too. Now, and it's good that he's doing that, because what he has done is he's ignited an entrepreneurial space race. You know, of course, we're aware of other ventures here in the United States, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic. But in fact, there are many around the world. I'm aware of at least 5 different entrepreneurial launch companies in China that have received substantial investment. I saw the launch of one of them, and they're hot on Musk's trail. They, within a few years, will have a vehicle comparable to a Falcon 9, which is to say better than any American launch vehicle except the Falcon 9. And of course, you know, New Zealand has reached orbit. New Zealand doesn't even have a space program, yet New Zealand has reached orbit through a private initiative, and not funded with discretionary money from a billionaire who wants to, you know, just see what he can do in his spare time, but by serious investors who got behind some engineers of ordinary means, and they're flying. So this is real. So the entrepreneurial space race is dramatically cheapening things. It's going to continue to dramatically cheapen things. And it also has made space fully international. In principle, anyway, at this point, you don't have to be a citizen of a country with a serious space program in order to be part of the space program. Such entrepreneurial ventures can be started anywhere. Now, the dynamic here is very healthy. As I say, Musk is already trying to make his current line, which is the best in the world, obsolete. This is not how people were thinking in the old space business at all. I mean, I can tell you, you know, during the period earlier in my career when I worked for Martin Marietta, we had the Titan IV was our launch vehicle. It was an evolved version that had come out of the Titan II and III. And by various changes in various things. But one thing that hadn't changed from the Titan II was the upper stage. And as a result, it was very underpowered for what should be on top of a Titan IV. So we, that is the engineers, went to the management and said, look, here is a design for an improved Titan IV upper stage. It will increase the cost of the launch vehicle by 10%, but double its payload capability. And the management said to us, look, if the Air Force wants us to improve the Titan, they'll pay us to do it. In other words, they had no internal drive to do it, to make the Titan IV much more capable and much more competitive. There was no competition and going on, and at least not in the commercial sense of the term. But okay, Musk, this is Silicon Valley thinking of working to make your existing product obsolete, even though it's working just fine, even though maybe it's the best in the business right now. It's good that he's doing this, because if he was to sit on his laurels with the Falcons, in a few years, there would be other people with equal capabilities and perhaps lower labor costs than California. He's not going to let the Chinese eat his lunch, but you have to keep moving fast. Now, if you're going to stay ahead when there's serious competition, as there now is. Now, furthermore, reducing the cost of space launch will also reduce the cost of spacecraft for a number of reasons. First of all, the cheaper the launches are, the more launches there will be. And so the more spacecraft there will be and the more people there will be in the game innovating. But furthermore, and the larger the production runs, which will also cheapen the cost of parts. But also, when space launch is very expensive, it forces spacecraft designers to be very conservative. If your launch costs $500 million, you're not going to change a part to a less proven part in order to save $1 million or to improve capability by 30%, when you are just going to, well, conceivably put this mission at risk. So if the launches are cheaper, the spacecraft designers can be less conservative. And because, I mean, for the past half century, the wisdom among spacecraft designers has been, don't use anything that hasn't been used before. Okay, this is like someone who says, I don't want to see any movies that I haven't seen before because I don't know if they're going to be good or not. So stick with The Wizard of Oz. I saw it as a kid. It is a good movie and I'm not going to take any chances. So that's a formula for stagnation, but that formula is being broken and will be broken in a very big way by this. So spacecraft will get cheaper. That will also contribute to increasing the number of space launches, which will contribute to reducing the cost of space launch. And it's a virtuous cycle. So that's a very good thing. Now, I believe there is another market. I mean, it is certainly fantastic to reduce the cost of space launch from $10,000 a kilogram to $2,000 a kilogram to $700 a kilogram. That's extraordinary change. But for instance, a person who is 100 kilograms together with his or her luggage can fly pretty much anywhere round trip in the United States or even to Europe for $500 to $1,000. So that's $5 to $10 a kilogram. How do we get costs down to that so that we have a space age comparable to the air age? You know, air travel was once exotic. Air travel, even when I was a kid, it was for the rich. It was something very special. People would dress up in suits and ties to go on an airplane. Now NASA's did do it before COVID. There needs to be a bigger market than satellite launch. I believe that market is point-to-point travel on Earth. You know, last year there were about 100 satellite launches worldwide. SpaceX got a quarter of them, which is sort of amazing. I think that at least half of them were done by governments that, like China or Russia, that SpaceX could not have competed for those launches. So they got fully half the launch market that was open. But still, 100 launches. Well, you make space launch cheaper. Okay, we're going to go to 200 launches. We're going to go to 300 launches. That's on the way. But there are hundreds of intercontinental flights every hour, not every year. And so how do we do that? Well, that's surface to surface. Now, if you look at Starship, it is a good candidate. It's arguably optimized for surface to surface. The first stage would take off, say, from oceanic platform off Los Angeles and land on it. The upper stage then goes nearly orbital and lands on an orbital platform near Sydney, Australia, 40 minutes later. So that's anywhere to anywhere on Earth in less than an hour. And of course, there'd be another first stage that would operate out of Sydney to launch things, and then the upper stage could go back to New Zealand or go back to Los Angeles, or could fly to a landing platform, off the coast of England or somewhere. I mean, or New York. And if you do the calculation, and especially it's interesting that mean, Musk chose methane as the fuel for Starship because it's what you can make on Mars. And as I showed it in Mars Direct, the best way to do a Mars mission is make your return propellant on Mars. The easiest good propellant combination to make on Mars is methane oxygen. But it has another virtue. It's the cheapest propellant. Liquefied natural gas is much cheaper than kerosene. And so as an aviation fuel, or in this case, as a surface-to-surface fuel, it has enormous advantages because, you know, the fuel costs, propellant costs for launch vehicles hardly mattered when you're expending the vehicle. Whether the propellant costs 10 cents a kilogram or $100 a kilogram, it's insignificant compared to the hardware cost you're throwing away. But once you have a reusable vehicle, as in aviation, then fuel costs do matter. And it takes a lot of fuel to fly from Los Angeles to Sydney, either in an airplane or a suborbital vehicle, but this is a cheaper fuel. And if you were to say that the propellant costs could only be 25% of the total mission cost, then we're talking about, and I do the math on this, it's in the book, ticket prices, Los Angeles to Sydney by a vehicle of this kind, about $20,000 a seat. Now, and now in that amount of time, in addition to getting to Sydney, you'd also have about half hour zero gravity and seeing space out the window. So as a deal, that kind of dramatically beats some of these suborbital offerings of a few minutes in zero gravity for $200,000. But furthermore, you're getting somewhere. So businesses who have to get to the meeting in Europe today, now, they go. Or executives who, you know, are so important or feel themselves to be so important that they can't afford to waste 18 hours on an airplane, can insist that the company pay for this. And $20,000 is the cost of a first-class ticket from Los Angeles to Sydney right now. So there are people that pay that. And in this case, you would actually have a material advantage. You would get there in less than an hour. Currently, a first-class ticket just offers a bigger seat and a tablecloth and a free drink or two. Hardly worth the large surcharge, except for the prestige. But this would be material. Now, if you did this, then, well, these are basically orbital vehicles. There'd be lots of them. That would greatly cheapen their costs. I think Musk has this in mind. You know, at Boca Chica, he's not building a ship, he's building a shipyard. His plan is to be turning these things out at a rate of one a week or faster, like Liberty ships. And his whole development program is based on this concept of make them, break them, find out what went wrong, try again. You know, one could argue that perhaps he might be productive to have a little tighter quality control on some of these Starship prototypes. But in any case, he's moving pretty fast. And the concept is that there'll be hundreds of them, thousands of them, just as there are thousands of Boeing 737s. And that, of course, will cheapen the engines, the avionics. All these things will be produced in mass production runs instead of limited production runs. You know, you can buy a pretty good car for $20,000. And a modern car is a far more complex thing than, say, a space shuttle main engine, which is now, they've given a new name, RS-25 or something, for the SLS is, you know, $150 million. And why? Because they're producing them in lots of 1, 2, 3, not lots of hundreds of thousands. Even though, as I say, the car is a more complex object. So this is going to make space travel very cheap and spacecraft very cheap. And this will make possible orbital enterprise. All the things that were advertised for the space shuttle, of the industries that you could do on orbit, research that you can do on orbit, could actually be done. They couldn't be done with space shuttle realistically, because of the enormous costs of the shuttle and the bureaucratic obstacles to getting payloads on the shuttle or on the space station. Of course, there have been a few noteworthy experiments made in space showed that they could do terrific fiber optic cables in zero gravity, but certainly you want cheaper transport to orbit if you're going to do this as a real business. And so Starship should realize the promise that was made with the space shuttle. And, you know, shuttles, they advertised that they could fly them 40 times a year. I think the highest they ever got was 8. But the, you know, SpaceX is currently launching every 2 weeks. So they could actually realize that. Now, this is a moon conference. Let's talk about the moon. Because to me, while doing activities like point-to-point travel, orbital industry, orbital tourism, you know, whatever, these are very interesting and they're good things. To me, they are a bridge to something much grander that I would like to contribute to creating, and that is humanity as a spacefaring species. That is, to me, the point of going into space is to travel across space and to visit, explore, develop, create new branches of human civilization on worlds on the other side of space. Okay, you know, that's like ships. You can do things at sea. You can go fishing, you can go on cruises, but the real value of ships is they take you across the ocean to the lands on the other side of the ocean. And so the new lands, that's to me what it's all about. Now, NASA, of course, right now has a program called Artemis. And there are some positive features to Artemis, which is the most positive feature about Artemis is its deadline, which is to land someone on the moon by 2024. You know, the Obama administration allegedly had a Mars program they called Journey to Mars, and I was not particularly a fan, even though I'm, as you know, very much a Mars person, because it had no deadline. It had no drive. It was, we're going to Mars someday. Well, if John F. Kennedy said, we're going to the moon someday, we never would have made it to the moon. For the program to be real, it has to have a deadline. And even if the deadline is missed by a year or a few, at least it represents a commitment to do something. And, you know, that NASA's human spaceflight program has been adrift since the end of Apollo. It has had no clear goal. Occasionally goals were stated, but they were put so far off in the future that they didn't have to be addressed. And so, for example, the President Bush's vision for space exploration announced in 2004 postulated landing on the moon by 2019, 15 years later, when it only took 8 years to do it the first time. And so when you say you're going to do something that far into the future, you're saying that you're not going to do it. You just hope that someone else is going to do it. And similarly, the Obama Mars program of, you know, orbiting Mars by 2033 or landing by 2048 is basically saying we hope that someone will do this someday, but we're not going to do it. So Artemis has a deadline. Okay, so that's a very good thing. And to a certain extent, it has energized NASA, but not enough, because the deadline is only being taken semi-seriously. You know, for example, the obvious thing to do, NASA right now has available to it a launch vehicle called the Falcon Heavy, which is flying. It has available to it a human-rated capsule, which has been demonstrated. And the Dragon, which weighs 9 tons compared to the Orion, which does not yet exist, which weighs 26. 26-ton Orion is so heavy that even the SLS, which does not yet exist, cannot deliver into low lunar orbit with enough propellant to fly home. And so they have to build a lunar orbiting space station in high lunar orbit for it to go to, in order for it to go anywhere. And of course, this lunar orbiting space station does not yet exist. And the requirement for a lunar landing and ascent vehicle to go to the lunar surface and back from that position, as opposed to low lunar orbit like Apollo, means that the landing and ascent vehicle needs about twice as much propellant as it would if it was using the low lunar orbit as its node. So the obvious answer here for this is to use Falcon Heavy with a Dragon to deliver a capsule into low lunar orbit, and use a Falcon Heavy and a LEM type vehicle, which could be much smaller than the one needed for transport from the space station, or the lunar orbiting space station, the deep space, the lunar orbit gateway or toll booth, whatever, to use that. You could fly an Apollo 8 style mission this year, okay? The capability is right there, and but they're not doing it. And you say, why not? And they say, politics. We would lose support if we didn't use SLS or Orion, which is another way of saying that we are doing this mission in the most time-consuming and expensive way possible, because when we give out money, people like us. Okay, how to make friends? Give out money. But this is not, and this is not how you get to the moon. You don't get to the moon by making your program as inefficient and time-consuming as possible. Okay, and so the question here for Artemis is it a purpose-driven program or is it a vendor-driven program? A purpose-driven program spends money to do things. A vendor-driven program does things in order to spend money. A purpose-driven program can accomplish a purpose. A vendor-driven program is simply a means of distributing funds. And therefore, its ability to actually accomplish anything is greatly reduced. So that's the question here. Now, now one can go beyond the expedient that I just described to you of just using an Apollo type architecture, but with two Falcon Heavies, one delivering the LEM, one delivering the Dragon, rendezvous in low lunar orbit, do the mission, LOR. That's straightforward. And frankly, anyone who's an engineer can see that that is a much better answer than the current Artemis baseline. Now, in my book, I described a more creative architecture, which I call Moon Direct, in which we don't do the mission that way. Because if you liberate your thinking, you say, well, lunar orbit rendezvous is an excellent way to do lunar exploration missions because staging your return propellant in lunar orbit reduces the total mass and so forth. That's why it was chosen by Apollo. If you have a moon base, you want to be on the moon for long periods of time, the correct architecture is direct return from the lunar surface using lunar propellants. Because if you can use lunar propellants, then lunar orbit rendezvous with terrestrial propellant staged in lunar orbit does not save mass. And furthermore, direct return from the lunar surface is much better if you're staying any length of time on the surface of the moon, because the launch window to Earth is always open. You're not dependent on a lunar orbiting spacecraft. You certainly don't have anybody playing Mike Collins for 4 months in lunar orbit, minding the store, while you're kicking up dirt on the surface, and you have no one minding the store. That's another problem. And but from the surface of the moon, looking at Earth, the Earth is always in the same position in the sky. The launch window is always open. And in fact, you know, a A LEM leaving the gateway has 3 kilometers a second to go down, 3 kilometers a second to come back up, 6. A LEM leaving the lunar surface and going on straight trans-Earth injection takes 3 kilometers a second to go on trans-Earth injection, and 3 kilometers a second, assuming it does not have an aeroshell, to do a propulsive capture in low Earth orbit. And then you could refuel it in low Earth orbit with something like a Falcon 9 and bring passengers to it in a Dragon, but the Dragon in that case would stay in low Earth orbit. And so with a single Falcon 9 launch, you could transfer a crew and enough propellant to fly it back to the moon. And now you've got round-trip lunar missions with a single Falcon 9 launch per mission. So that's excellent. Now, of course, if starships are available, you could do better. But looking at the tool set that is currently flyable, there are far superior alternatives to the current Artemis spaceline, because the current Artemis spaceline is corrupted by the need to please certain constituents. And frankly, Artemis would be better off saying, okay, SLS, you can have your money, but just please don't make us use you. Because they could get to the moon a lot faster that way. Just saying, okay, you're a tax, just don't get in our way. It's kind of like Europa Clipper, where someone is insisting that Europa Clipper uses SLS, which makes no sense. Now, I'm not totally on board with everything SpaceX says. For instance, this idea of using Starship as a lunar landing and ascent vehicle does not appeal to me at all. And there's a number of issues with that. First of all, the amount of refueling you would have to do, first in low Earth orbit and then in lunar orbit to land it with enough propellant to fly it home. It's about 20 Starship launches to fly one Starship round trip. And the reason for that is the Starship is, so massively heavy that, here it is, has a dry mass of 100 tons compared to the LEM, Apollo LEM upper stage had a dry mass of 2 tons. So it's 50 times as much to refuel a Starship on the surface of the moon. Okay, if you have ISRU, you have to do an enormous amount of propellant making. So it's not attractive as an ascent vehicle at all. Now, as a one-way lander, it offers something because you land a Starship on the moon and leave it there. Now you have an apartment house on the moon. Okay, that's fine. But then there are some technical issues associated with a very large plume impingement that you would generate with a Starship while landing, and which I do not believe is adequately answered by the proposal to put engines up near the top. Just the amount of thrust you need to land is very large. And now, perhaps after a moon base is established and a landing pad, a hardened landing pad can be created, then a Starship could be landed there and it greatly enhance the base capabilities. But certainly not for use as an ascent vehicle. But one very attractive use for Starship relatively early in the program, aside from as a fully reusable heavy lift launch vehicle, which is an enormous benefit, if you want to go beyond that, I would deliver a Starship to lunar orbit and leave it there with a lot of methane oxygen propellant still in its tanks. And it could act as a tanker refueling much smaller landing and ascent vehicles that use methane oxygen propellant. And for instance, the Dynetics lander that has been proposed is a methane oxygen vehicle. And it would make an excellent landing craft to be based off of a Starship tanker in low lunar orbit. And in fact, if it only had to go to low lunar orbit as opposed to back and forth to this, the gateway, the Dynetics lander could become fully reusable. And that would also be an attractive architecture. So there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, and but what they have in common is that they only work if you don't let yourself be forced by vendor-driven imperatives. You have to be able to design the correct architecture, or you're not going to get to the correct architecture. You have to be able to optimize the mission based on engineering criteria and not on criteria of paying off various interested parties. Because especially in this case where there is a very large divergence between what the interest parties have to offer and what the best things on offer are. And that's the other thing about the entrepreneurial space race. If NASA is to help drive it, NASA must be freed to choose the most cost-effective choice. In other words, if you want merit to be incentivized, then NASA has to be free to choose launch vehicles, spacecraft, all other technologies based on merit and not based on political imperatives that are unrelated to merit. This is how NASA can best support the space revolution, simply by being an intelligent customer, okay? A customer who is free to choose, okay? Free to choose the best solution. If the customer is free to choose the best solution, the market will provide the best solution. If the customer is not free to choose the best solution, the market has no incentive to provide the best solution, okay? So this is very important. I am in total disagreement with people who say we have an entrepreneurial revolution going on. We don't need NASA. We very much need NASA, but we need NASA to be free to choose the best technologies and the best providers available. Okay, if it is, okay, if it's free to choose the best, it will promote the best and the best will succeed. So, I mean, that's the thing about a free market, okay? Both the suppliers have got to be free to supply whatever they would like to offer, and the customer has got to be free to choose what it finds best. And that's how you get to the best. Now, one reason why I am, well, I'm a space advocate, so I'm for an effective program to develop the moon. But in my particular role as a Mars advocate, I am very much interested in having an efficient lunar program because I don't want the lunar program to be a quagmire that ties up our resources and makes it impossible to attempt anything more ambitious for decades to come. You know, the Artemis architecture, which requires 2 SLS launches for every lunar mission, as well as further launches to maintain the gateway, is extremely inefficient, and it may not even be workable. Because it also requires 6 rendezvous in each mission, 5 spacecraft flight elements, and all this stuff. And but let's put Starship aside for a minute. If SLS is the heaviest launch vehicle you have, do you really want to tie it up doing lunar missions? Okay, you could say, well, I'll use it for my first lunar mission because I need it until I have lunar oxygen available. But after that, you want to hand things off. You know, it's like you take Normandy Beach with your top combat divisions, but after the beach is taken, you don't keep your top combat divisions there administering the beach. They can be done by rear echelon units. Okay, the best units have got to go liberate the rest of France. And so it's the same thing here. With Moon Direct, yes, it uses heavy lift, either Falcon Heavies or SLS, if you will, to establish the base. But the first priority is establishing lunar oxygen production or lunar hydrogen and oxygen production if you're at the pole. And after that, you can continue doing lunar missions with a single Falcon 9 launch. And you know, here's Falcon 9 launching 25 of them a year right now. And if you have a moon base and you need one Falcon 9 launch per mission, and each mission spends 3 months on the moon, okay, 4 out of your 24 Falcon 9s are supporting an effective moon base. And now you have your heavy lift vehicles free to support Mars. Now, for Mars, I believe the first priority immediately is the development of a heavy lander. And NASA people frequently, when they came up with ridiculous plans to create a Lunar Orbit Gateway or a Mars Orbit Gateway or something, would say, well, we're doing this because we don't have a Mars heavy lander. Well, if you don't have a Mars heavy lander, the solution is not to build orbital space stations that don't land. The solution is to develop a Mars heavy lander. And a Falcon, not a Falcon 9, a Falcon Heavy could throw a sufficient payload to Mars for a correctly designed lander to land 20 tons on Mars, which is a sufficient amount to, I mean, it's of sufficient size. You can build human Mars missions if you have that capability. SLS, 30 tons. Starship, we use Starship as just a reusable Earth to orbit vehicle, 40 tons. But whether it's 20, 30, 40, you need at least 10 at bare minimum, 10-ton landing capability compared to 1 ton for the Curiosity landing system. You need to be in the 10-ton ballpark. And as I said, Falcon Heavy could get you up to around 20, which is fine. And I'd like to see development of a heavy Mars lander. And we can start the Mars program straight away, launching these things to Mars with Falcon Heavies, demonstrate the entry and landing, and start establishing facilities on Mars. Now, these could be massive scientific expeditions. You don't land 1 rover on Mars, you land 30, you know, and you, okay, Normandy Beach, okay, lower the plank, and out the LST comes the robot battalion and fan out, and many of these will be instruments for all kinds of scientists. The scientists have numerous competing ideas on what instruments should be on rovers. This would allow us to try out a lot of them, but also many of them could just be photography rovers that could go and image an entire region of Mars in virtual reality, high definition, and all that data could be sent back to Earth, and we would have on Earth a virtual reality simulacrum, not of an artist's conception of Mars, but an actual region of Mars where these rovers are operating, and human beings could put on VR gear and start walking around the landscape and studying the rocks and so forth, and say, hey, this is anomalous, this thing over here. Hey, bring a rover over here and hit this thing with a hammer because I want to knock the crust off. Is this a fossil? Let's have a look at it. So demonstrating a kind of virtual human robot collaboration in scientific exploration. It would greatly democratize the exploration process. Millions of people could participate in it. And that would be a precursor for sending human astronauts to Mars and having virtual human assistants in large numbers helping them explore the areas and demonstrate a new kind of thing. But also, of course, heavy landers could start landing power facilities on Mars, whether these are nuclear reactors or fields of solar panels, if you want to go that way. Set up an ISRU plant, get ISRU production going, just prepare the whole landing. And since now you've proven the lander and you've proven ISRU and you have power available, well, at a certain point, you put a HAB module on the virtual lander and you send out the crew. So we could get this going straight away. But once again, I think what NASA should do is say, okay, here's the thing. We have a vehicle that can send 30 tons on trans-Mars injection. If you've got 30 tons and you're approaching Mars, how much payload can you land on Mars? What's your design? And compete it in some way and get it done. And now, of course, Starship is developed. Once again, I like Starship much better as a fully reusable heavy lift launch vehicle. Saturn V capability at, 1/10 or less the cost of an SLS. What's not to like? Flying Starship all the way to Mars means you only get to use that Starship once every 3 years instead of once a week if you just went up to orbit and back. But furthermore, once again, as an Earth return vehicle, because it's so heavy, it greatly increases the ISRU requirement. One solution for that would be to use Mars Direct type vehicles of the kind that I designed. Another would be to have a mini Starship, which would be about a fifth the size of the big Starship. It would be sized to be a reusable upper stage on the Falcon 9. And that in itself would be a very usable commercial vehicle, a fully reusable medium with launch vehicle. But that upper stage, that mini Starship, with all its propellant, could be lifted to orbit by the big Starship, and it could fly to Mars, and it'd be much easier to refuel that and send it back than the big ship. So these are some of the things on the horizon. But once again, and by the way, I think Starship is going to ignite the Mars program. I think I think Musk's projections of reaching orbit, of course he'd reach orbit by this spring, and I said no, make it 2 years, and I think that's more realistic. But whether it's 2 years or 3 years, I'm pretty sure Starship will regularly be flying to orbit by 2024. And we'll have a new president elected in 2024, and he or she will turn to their advisors. And if Starships are flying regularly to orbit, by then, that person will turn to his or her advisors and say, look, can we have people on Mars by the end of my second term? And the answer is certainly going to be yes. Will it cost hundreds of billions of dollars? No. Tens of billions? Maybe 10 billion. Well, then let's do it. And at that point, we could get a government commitment to join in a Mars program, have NASA meet Musk halfway, because there are things that need to be developed to develop Mars that would be very difficult for Musk to develop. For instance, space nuclear reactors, which require highly enriched uranium. And I think that by making the program practical, the Musk and the other space entrepreneurs are going to make it sellable, and it will sell. And so we're going to go to Mars. Now, the space launch revolution, okay, it will take us beyond Mars to the asteroids, outer solar system, and beyond. It will also greatly enhance science programs. It already is. The Test Space Telescope was launched on a Falcon 9, and the NASA Science Directorate, which was looking to save money, not to be playing Santa Claus, was able to save $200 million compared to launching it on a Delta IV. So that helped science. But this is having effects that are outside of the space community, and I talk about this in the book. One of the most noteworthy areas is fusion power. Now, fusion power, people have talked about fusion power since the first hydrogen bomb was set off, early 50s. There's been a fusion program, and actually did make some significant progress under Cold War competition. But once that ebbed, the fusion program has been stagnating since the 80s. And people have adopted a cynical attitude of, well, it's always going to be in the future. It's never really going to happen. Well, what happened was, as a result of the success of SpaceX, some people with very serious money took a second look at fusion, and they said, maybe the problem with fusion was the same problem as with reusable space launch. Maybe it wasn't fundamentally a technical problem. Maybe it was fundamentally an institutional problem. And so entrepreneurial fusion startups are getting funded, and I'm talking about with serious money, hundreds of millions of dollars. Try Alpha Energy in California has gotten $500 million in investment. That's more than the US government fusion program. And these people are not developing fusion on a multi-decadal timeline. They're answering to investors. They want to have real accomplishments within 3, 5, 6 years, and they will. And I think that, so a secondary result of the space launch revolution is going to be a revolution in fusion energy. And just as I think as a result of the space launch revolution, we will have people on Mars by the end of the 2020s, I think we're going to have fusion by the end of the 2020s. And this is particularly interesting to me because I actually worked in the fusion program in the 80s. It was at Los Alamos. And I remember one departmental lunch we had, and the head of the division just made an offhand comment. And he said, you know, when fusion power is finally developed, it won't be at a place like Los Alamos or Livermore. It will be a couple of crackpots working in a garage. And well, everybody laughed at that because fusion power is hard and requires big machines and expensive stuff and not really the kind of stuff that garage inventors are likely to be able to get. But if not a couple of crackpots working in a garage, a startup working in a warehouse, yes, I think that is what is going to happen. And when fusion power comes, it's not just going to help the Earth, it's going to help spacefarers. Because fusion power is not just another way to light light bulbs. It's a new kind of energy. It can do new kinds of things. For example, fusion rockets, which in principle can get exhaust velocities up to 7% the speed of light. And a well-engineered rocket can achieve velocities up to twice its exhaust velocity, which means we're talking about transportation systems that can travel at up to 10% the speed of light. That is a beginner's capability for interstellar travel. So we're opening a road here, and the road is going to take us to orbit, to the moon, to Mars. It's going to take us interstellar. And this is where it is beginning. So I'd be happy to take questions.
All right, well, thanks for that interesting talk, Robert. Let's get to a couple of questions. Connections Live asks, can you compare how much ISRU decreases transport costs compared to reducing launch costs?
Well, it depends how much you reduce launch costs, but you want to do both. You definitely want to reduce launch costs, but a long time ago, back in the 80s, I was a strong advocate at that point of advanced propulsion, electric propulsion, for example. And I had a very interesting conversation at that time with Kraft Erica, who was a member of the von Braun team and was a lunar advocate. And he made a point to me that has stuck with me ever since. He said to me, look, you can have electric propulsion system with a space nuclear reactor, and it can give you a specific impulse of, say, 3,000 seconds, and which is much more than you can get with a hydrogen-oxygen rocket, which is 450 seconds. This is the number of seconds a pound of fuel can give you a pound of thrust. It's how we rate the effectiveness of rockets. But now at this time, we knew, of course, you could get oxygen from the moon. We did not know that there was water on the moon. So he said, well, we go to the moon, we make oxygen from lunar iron oxides, and we bring the hydrogen. So now we have a rocket that has an ISP of 450 seconds, but 6/7 of the mass of its propellant is coming from the moon. So it has a leverage of 7 to 1. That is, you get 7 times as much propellant as the amount of propellant you bought. Well, 7 times 450 is 3,000. So you have the same specific impulse as electric propulsion, but at high thrust. And instead of a massive space nuclear reactor that you have to haul all over the place, you have a little RL-10. And instead of having to exert the thrust over 6 months or a year, you can do the burn in 20 minutes and be on your way. And so that what ISRU is, it's a way of taking energy from, say, a nuclear reactor or even from a large solar array and storing it in chemical form where is very portable and can be released over a very short period of time. So so that's the advantage of ISRU. And the further out you go, or the further into a gravity well you go, the more it benefits you, because the more penalty there would be to take the propellant there. And so, but it's fundamental. And there's a second point about ISRU. Okay. And by the way, I don't really like to call in situ it ISRU. I call it local resource creation, because you see, not in situ resource utilization. See, I don't believe there is any such thing as a natural resource. Natural resources do not exist. There are only natural raw materials. It is technology, human creativity in action, that turns materials into resources. Uranium was not a resource until we developed nuclear power. Okay, aluminum was not a resource till we developed means of separating it from aluminum oxide. You know, the pioneers of the Old West. I live here in Colorado. You go into an Old West antique store, you won't see a single item made of aluminum. No pioneer ever saw aluminum. To them, it was dirt. Okay, the oil was not a resource till we developed oil drilling and refining and things that could run on the product. Iron was not a resource in the Bronze Age. That's why they were using bronze. To them, iron was dirt, and so they were using much more geochemically rare and far more expensive elements. So once you develop the technology for smelting iron out of iron ore, all of a sudden you have this cheap metal that did not exist before. Land was not a resource till people invented agriculture. So the moon and Mars have no resources on them now. They will once there are resourceful people there. And so this is a very important principle. A place is habitable for you if you can take the materials there and turn them into resources. If you're stranded in the woods and there's a pond and you know how to make fishing gear, then the fish in that pond are a resource for you. If you don't, they are not. So this is a very fundamental point. If we are going to develop space, we must engage in local resource creation. That is how we settled the Earth, okay? By being able to create resources wherever we went. That is how we're going to settle space.
Okay, James Melton asks, what are your thoughts on the new SpaceX spacesuits that Doug and Bob are using on Demo 2? And will they serve a purpose for moon travel? Also, are Diva Newman's designs being considered for use in the short term?
Okay, well, these are both innovative designs. Okay, now I don't know the specifics of the SpaceX suit as to whether it could be used on the surface of the moon or not. There are certain additional requirements that would be needed on the surface of the moon due to thermal variations, dust, and so forth. But I imagine they could be modified to be used on the moon. The Dava Newman, who is a professor at MIT, who also has done a few turns in high-level NASA positions, are very innovative. They represent a different principle altogether of spacesuit design, which is instead of using pneumatic pressure, they use elastic pressure, so that instead of this big, Stay Puft Snowman spacesuits that we've been wearing, these would be far more nimble. Although, for instance, on Mars, in addition to the spacesuit, you'd want to wear a ski jacket, but that's easily done. But yeah, the Dava Newman has done a lot of extremely interesting research, and I'd like to see that taken forward.
Okay, Saga Knight asks, could Musk go to Mars without the help of NASA, or does he have to play with NASA to succeed?
Strictly speaking, he could go, but I don't think he will. Musk does not have unlimited resources. He has a lot more resources than most of us, but he doesn't have unlimited resources. And as you can see, he is developing SpaceX on, well, he's put a lot of his own money into it, but he's also attempting to leverage public money wherever he can. So he's developed the Dragons and Falcons. Actually, the initial development he did on his own, but he managed to get himself paid back by creating a logistic capability for the space station that wasn't there before, and now a human transportation system. He's kind of like a person trying to cross a river by hopping from rock to rock, taking maximum advantages of whatever rocks happen to be there. Now, as I said, there's a raft of systems that need to be developed in order to do human exploration of Mars. These include, first and foremost, surface power systems and ISRU systems, but other kinds of systems. SpaceX is focused on the transportation system. I think that we, as American citizens, should insist that our space program meet him halfway and develop these other systems that are needed for Mars, and not put the full burden on him. And I think he's doing a very good faith effort. I mean, the transportation system is the tallest pole, and he's doing it. So NASA should develop space nuclear power. NASA should develop ISRU. NASA should develop spacesuits that are designed for the Martian surface. NASA should develop Mars rovers and lunar rovers, and all sorts of other surface technologies. So, you know, let's meet him halfway.
Great. Owen Chibani asks, if Starship is eventually going to be cheap and reliable enough for point-to-point travel, why would the amount of refueling trips be a large consideration, especially considering the massive size of Starship and its payload and habitation capacity compared to the national team and Dynetics landers?
I think that having to do 20 Starship launches to land something on the moon and return, compared to stationing a Starship in lunar orbit and having a reusable Dynetics lander go up and down 20 times off of one Starship, there's no comparison in the efficiency of that. And furthermore, as I say, landing a Starship on a virgin lunar site creates major difficulties. The exhaust velocity of a methane oxygen engine is greater than lunar escape velocity. Not only would you scatter debris all over the region of the moon that you're in, you could send debris all the way back to Earth. It's just doesn't make sense. Now, sending a small lander with a team that could prepare a landing pad and then land Starships one way on the moon, and now you have a base on the moon, is okay. Landing a Starship on the moon makes some sense. It's an enormous facility. Using Starship as an ascent vehicle is like taking an aircraft carrier whitewater rafting. It's just the wrong vehicle for the job.
Okay, next question is from Joseph Phillips. He asks, would you see electromagnetic launch as a good long-term option for lunar material export?
It could be. Electromagnetic launch, catapult launch, paper I wrote back in 1990 with David Baker exploring the tether launch system are all very interesting for the moon. Another very interesting thing for the moon is a skyhook, or I guess the current term is space elevator. These are not practical for Earth because of the gravity affects the mass of the space hook exponentially, but on the moon it's possible, and also you don't have to deal with air. And I think a lunar space elevator would be very interesting. So there are ways to get stuff off the surface of the moon. Now, if you're just sending materials, yes, catapults and electromagnetic launchers and mass drivers like Gerard O'Neill liked, and these are all possibilities. Of course, a space elevator would allow you to send payloads of any size, including human payloads, up and down from the surface of the moon to orbit, and even if the elevator went beyond the orbital point on trans-Earth or trans-Mars injection for that matter.
Calvin Gluck asks, can you comment briefly on why you made a strong argument against returning to the moon in the case for Mars, and now seem more willing to advocate for returning to the moon? Do you still feel that it would be better to focus all of our efforts on Mars alone?
Well, I never advocated focusing all of our efforts on Mars alone. I have advocated, and I still believe, that Mars should be our primary goal. There were people who agreed with me on that. For instance, John Young, who said, nevertheless, we should integrate a lunar program into the Mars program, and as a step along the way. That's a reasonable proposition. It's a debatable proposition. But the thing is this, I'm actually not advocating a return to the moon as such. What I am saying is, if you want to return to the moon, let's have a program that actually returns to the moon. In other words, if you say we have to go back to the moon before we go to Mars, then I'm saying, okay, then let's get on with it. I'm saying if we do have a return to the moon program, let's make it an efficient return to the moon program, one that gets us back to the moon and gives us an effective capability on the moon. I've always believed that as part of becoming a space civilization, the development of the moon is part of that. But frankly, you know, I was 17 when we landed on the moon. And if anybody told me then that I'd be 68 and we'd be sitting here talking about, can we ever get to the moon? I would have thought they were just crazy. And there really is a tremendous lowering of our ambitions. Now, Mars, it is sort of incredible that here we are a half century later, and well, today is literally 51 years later to the day of the moon landing. And we're talking about how we can get to the moon. I mean, this is crazy. We're better than this. And, you know, we went to the moon. Okay, now the goals were not scientific. We wanted to astonish the world with what free people could do. And I can tell you we did, because I was in Leningrad when we landed on the moon. And we astonished the world with what free people could do. We really did it. And that was really something. And I was a chess player as a kid. And I was over there. And all the Russians I knew were, you know, Marietta. I mean, they thought it was great. We had excelled in a sport that they appreciated, as it were. And the leaders may have been having kittens, but the people thought, wow, you Americans are really something. And well, let me tell you how we do it. Freedom. And okay, so that was something. But here we are a half century later, and are we really going to inspire the world with doing something we did 50 years ago? Are we really going to inspire the youth of today with something their grandparents did? You know, Mars is where the science is. It's where the challenge is, and it's where the future is. It's far richer in materials for development than the moon. So it's much more promising in that respect. You know, it's where we're going to find out the truth about biology, whether life is unique to the Earth or a general phenomenon in the universe, or whether the life as we find it on Earth is the pattern for all life everywhere. Does all life use DNA and RNA, or is it a far more general phenomena? And biology, by the way, you know, is real nanotechnology. It's programmable micro machines. And we can find out a lot more about fundamental biology. The applications of that are going to be fantastic. You know, it's like going from vacuum tubes is the only way to build computers to going to chips, and and then, as I say, it's the future. But sure, I think we can have a moon program, a workable moon Mars program. But you know, here they have a moon program, and they say, but before we land on the moon, we really have to build a space station in lunar orbit. Well, screw that. We don't need a space station in lunar orbit to land on the moon. We did it last time, and it wasn't, you know, the Lunar Orbit Gateway, which was previously called the Deep Space Gateway, was thought of by the Obama administration as an alternative to landing on the moon, because they were not committed to going to the moon. They just wanted to have a place that Orion could go to in order to go somewhere, in order to pretend that it was doing something. Okay, so sure, let's develop the moon. Let's develop Mars. Let's develop asteroids. Let's do each of these as efficiently as they can be done in order to maximize all the things that we can do. I'm gonna have to go in about 5 minutes. So, okay, well, I guess I'm the one taking up all the time, but let's ask questions. I'll try to give shorter answers.
No problem. John Jossi asks, are you in discussions with Musk on some of your ideas for mission architectures using Starship?
Yes.
Easy answer. All right, the next one's from Michael Boazzo. He has a two-part question. The first one is, when SpaceX first started in 2002, did you initially react with skepticism like many others in the space industry when Elon made his pitch about reusability and lowering the cost to enable missions to Moon Mars possible? Or did you instantly see the compatibility with Mars Direct?
Well, when SpaceX started in 2002, the central idea was not, in fact, reusability. It was that you could beat the launch majors on cost by having a much lower overhead company, which was unquestionably true. That is, the overheads at Lockheed Martin and McDonnell Douglas, who's now Boeing, were fantastical, and clearly a more efficient company could beat them on cost. The original, the Falcon 1, was not a particularly innovative vehicle from a technical point of view, nor was the Falcon 9 initially. So just two-stage kerosene oxygen launch vehicle, that was okay. The place where there was skepticism, though, was whether he could do it. Because not from a technical point of view, per se, there was nothing, in other words, his design was far more conservative than, say, rotary rocket, which had very innovative and somewhat disputable principle behind its design. There was no question about that his technical approach was workable. It was whether you could really do this with private money. There had been a whole parade of zillionaires that come along in the 90s who, you know, put some money in and then quit when the going got tough. And people looked at this, practically everybody who looked at this said, well, here comes another rich kid who thinks he can open the space frontier because it looks easy. But what Musk did was different, because Musk did not just, you know, throw, you know, $50 million or something at some visionary engineer and say, have a good time, and then quit when it wasn't easy. He, first of all, you know, when I first met Musk in 2001, he had a scientific background. He understood scientific principles. He didn't know anything about rockets, nothing. But he learned. And so, for instance, by 2004, I had a long discussion with him in his factory, first factory, not the current one, El Segundo, I think it was. And he knew a lot about rockets by then. In other words, he put his mind into it. He didn't, this wasn't just play money. He put his mind and his full talent into it, both his engineering talent, which he proceeded to develop in a very impressive way, and also his political and business talent. He didn't leave this thing to be handled by people who, well, there are very few people with business talent equal to Elon Musk, but you needed that much business talent to make this thing happen. And to political talent to outmaneuver the majors who were shutting him out of the launch sites and all this kind of stuff, and looking for any excuse to say, well, those rockets are unsafe, we can't let them be launched near America, and all this. But he was still actually a bit naive, because I'll tell you, he hadn't launched yet in 2004, but the Falcon 1 was coming along, and the time that it would launch was in sight. And I said to him, you know, Elon, you're going to have to be prepared to do this at least 3 times because the first 2 are going to fail. And he says to me, why? What is the problem with my design? Tell me why it's going to fail. And I said to him, I don't know why it's going to fail. I haven't examined your design. It's certainly not in any detail. But I just know that these things are really complicated and there's a lot that can go wrong, and it probably will. And you just have to be ready for it to fail, because it's going to fail the first couple of times. Well, I then met him again in 2007 at the big factory, and by then the first 2 Falcon 1s had failed. And he says to me, I'm good for 1 more try. If it fails, then I'm done, I'm out. Well, it did fail the 3rd time. He stuck with it anyway. And the 4th time it succeeded. And that's how he learned the truth about rocketry. But he was tough enough, and none of his predecessors were. He was smart enough to actually learn the field himself and tough enough to stick with it, even though it failed 3 times on him. So yeah, fortune favors the brave and fortune favors the tough. And fortune favors the smart. And he's all 3, smart, brave, and tough. And that's why this has worked. And but he's opened the door. And I will say this, Musk, is a risk taker. He skates very close to the edge of the ice. And this isn't a sure thing. It's possible he'll fail. It's possible he'll fail because of a technical failure. It's possible he'll fail because he tweets something stupid and gets himself into trouble with the authorities. But in a sense, he's already won. He's proven the point. He's proven the value of entrepreneurial space. And this cat can never be put back in the box. The world has changed.